I was there the afternoon Boone Callister rode back into his own camp and found his children eating corn mush they had no right to have. That's where the whole thing starts, not with a romance, not with a courtship, not with anything the word love usually gets attached to. It starts with a cold crossroads in the dry spur basin, 3 hungry kids, and a flour sack that appeared out of nowhere. I'm Ira Cade, and I punched cattle for Boone Callister going on 11 years before he finally made me his foreman, so I figure I earned the right to tell it plain. I saw most of it. What I didn't see, Boone told me himself years later, on a porch in the evening with the mountains going purple behind the ridge. The way men talk when they've finally stopped being embarrassed by the good that happened to them. That October, we'd been pushing a small herd north along the dry spur basin toward the winter pasture on Callister Range. It was one of those Colorado autumns that can't make up its mind, warm enough at noon to fool you, cold enough by dark to split your lip. Boone had his 3 kids with him because there was nobody else to leave them with. His wife, Clara, had died the previous spring of a fever that took her in 4 days and didn't apologize for it, and Boone hadn't found his footing since. He was a big man, wide in the shoulder, and grief had made him wider somehow, like it had packed itself into his frame and hardened. He spoke when spoken to, and not a great deal more. He loved those children, Eli, who was 9, and the twins Nora and me, who were 7, with the ferocity of a man who'd already lost too much to risk losing anything else. But he wasn't easy company, even for them. He provided. He was steady. He didn't laugh much. The day in question, Boone had ridden ahead to scout a stream crossing, leaving me and Ruddy Tate to mind the kids and the drag of the herd. The plan was to camp at Butte Cross, where 2 cattle trails met between a dry wash and a stand of juniper, and push the last 8 miles to home range the next morning. It was a reasonable plan. What was not reasonable was what happened to it. I'd let the kids climb down and stretch their legs while Ruddy and I got the fire going. Eli found a lizard and made the twins look at it. Standard issue. I had my back to them, feeding kindling when Nora called out, "Ira, there's a woman." I turned. Up the westward trail, maybe 60 yards out, a single rider was moving at a slow walk, a brown horse, a woman in a gray-brown coat, a bedroll and 2 canvas panniers slung behind the saddle. She wasn't coming toward camp exactly. She was on the trail that crossed ours at the Butte, moving north to south, and she was going to pass maybe 40 feet from our fire. She saw us about the same time I saw her, and she did what most lone travelers did in those years when they came upon a strange camp at dusk. She slowed. She didn't stop. She angled wide enough to be clear about her intentions and kept moving. She was maybe 40-some years, with a face that had been in the weather and showed it, not hard but weathered, like good leather. She had dark hair threaded with gray under the hat brim. She rode easy, like she'd been in a saddle her whole life, which I later learned she had. The twins waved at her because twins that age wave at everything. She raised a hand back, a small clean gesture, and kept going. That was all. She rode south along the cross trail, and inside 2 minutes she was past the juniper and gone. I went back to my fire. Ruddy said about the salt pork. The kids ate what we had, which wasn't much. We'd miscalculated the provisions for the extra 2 days the herd had cost us, and there wasn't enough to put in 3 growing children the way they deserved. Eli didn't complain. Eli was 9 and the man of things in his own mind since his mother died. The twins ate quietly too, because they'd learned from Eli that complaining costs something, though they couldn't have told you what. That was the first evening. The woman on the brown horse passed our camp, raised her hand at 2 waving twins, and rode away. The second morning, I was up before light getting the coffee on. What I found at the edge of camp, set neatly on a flat rock 20 feet from the fire ring, where the night watch would find it but where it couldn't be mistaken for something blown in, was a flour sack tied with a strip of rawhide, and beside it, a paper twist of smoked venison strips, enough for 6 or 8 servings. The flour sack held a good 2 pounds of cornmeal and a small wax paper packet of dried sage. Nobody in camp had put it there. Ruddy hadn't seen anyone. The night watch, a young hand named Pearson who fell asleep half the time anyway, hadn't seen anyone. But I recognized the brown horse's shoe print in the soft dirt beside the rock, a distinctive nick in the left rear iron, slightly splayed. She'd come back in the night, set the food down, and ridden away again before first light. Hadn't knocked, hadn't announced herself, just left it. I stood there in the cold with my coffee tin and looked at that flour sack for a good while. Then I made corn mush for 3 children and didn't say a word about where it came from, because I hadn't decided yet what there was to say. Boone came back from the crossing mid-morning and found his kids well fed and easier than they'd been in days. He looked at me. I told him what I'd found and showed him the print. He looked at the flat rock. He looked at the cross trail heading south. "She left it in the night," he said. "That's how it appears. Didn't ask for anything. No. Just left it and went." Boone stood there with his hat in his hands, the way he stood when he was working something through. He was quiet for a long time. "Get the herd moving," he said finally, and he put his hat back on and went to his horse. He didn't say anything else about it the whole push home, but I watched him. Twice on that last 8 miles I caught him looking south, back toward the cross trail, with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since before Clara died. I couldn't have named it exactly. It wasn't sentiment. It was more like attention, like a man who's been half asleep a long time and something small and unexpected tapped him on the shoulder, and he was still deciding whether to turn around. We got the herd in on a Thursday. By Sunday, Boone was asking questions. He was subtle about it for Boone. He rode into Cutter's Flat on the pretense of picking up the mail and some axle grease, which he did. But he also stopped into the land office and into Mabel Prute's dry goods, which was the nearest thing the basin had to a telegraph, because Mabel knew everything and told most of it. I know because he told me himself later, and also because Mabel told me first, because that's how Mabel was. What he got was this. A woman named Miriam Holt had been coming and going through the basin for the better part of 2 seasons. She held a small claim up at Holt's Crossing, an abandoned homestead site, originally filed by a man named Ezra Holt who died without heirs and whose name had somehow stuck to the creek bend even after the property changed hands twice. Miriam had bought the remainder on the 3rd transfer cheap, because the claim came with a half-collapsed soddy, a dry well, and no cleared acreage to speak of. People assumed she'd walk away from it before the first hard freeze. She hadn't. She was a widow out of a settlement called Parish Ford, 3 counties south, and before that from somewhere back east that nobody had thought to ask about. She had some kind of small seamstress trade, took in mending and alterations from ranches within a day's ride, and she kept to herself in the way that made people respect her without necessarily knowing her. Boone absorbed this. He came home with the axle grease and the mail and a look on his face I was beginning to recognize, that quiet, turned toward something attention. He didn't ride to Holt's Crossing that week. He didn't ride there the next week either. I think he was arguing with himself, and the argument was close enough that it kept coming out a draw. Part of it was the grief, still heavy in him even after 7 months. Part of it was pride. He wasn't a man who chased after things, or who knew how to receive a kindness without feeling the weight of owing it. And part of it was probably something simpler and harder. He didn't know what he'd say. It was Eli who broke the stalemate. Eli had heard his father asking about the flour sack woman, had overheard it, the way 9-year-olds overhear everything. And one evening at the kitchen table he looked up from his plate and said, very directly, the way Eli did everything, "Are we going to thank her, Pa?" Boone looked at his son. "It's the right thing," Eli said. He wasn't asking. He was telling, in the diplomatic way of a 9-year-old who has figured out that framing a statement as a statement is safer than framing it as a demand. Boone was quiet. "The twins want to," Eli added, which was either true or a very effective piece of leverage, and knowing Eli, probably both. Boone said he'd think on it. but I saw his jaw do the thing it did when he'd already made a decision and was just giving himself time to catch up to it. He rode to Holt's Crossing on a Wednesday, 11 days after we'd pushed the herd in. He took all 3 kids, which I took as either a peace offering or armor, maybe both. He told me about the ride later, and I'll tell it the way he told it to me, as close as I can remember, because Boone wasn't a man who embellished, so what he gave me was already stripped down to the essential. The claim was a hard 2-hour ride northeast of the home ranch. The creek at Holt's Crossing ran clear even in October, which was one of the few things working in the property's favor. The soddy sat about 30 yards back from the bank, or rather, what remained of a soddy, which was 1 full wall, 2 partial walls, and a roof that had been patched so many times with salvaged lumber and tin that it looked like a map of prior disasters. Someone had filled the worst gaps with banked earth and covered the tin patches with tar paper. It was not comfortable. It was weather-resistant in the most technical sense, and that was about all you could say for it. There was a small kitchen garden laid in for winter, garlic, and a few root vegetables, neat rows under a thin mulch of straw. A hobbled mule, brown and ancient-looking, stood in a 3-sided shelter that was in considerably better repair than the soddy, which Boone noted and filed away as a piece of information about the woman's priorities. A washing line held 3 mended shirts, stiff in the October cold. Miriam Holt was sitting outside on a camp stool beside a brazier, doing what she did for a living, stitching. She had a pair of men's wool trousers across her lap and a needle working in and out of the knee. She looked up when she heard the horses. She didn't look alarmed. She looked at Boone the way a woman looks at something she's not sure she has to deal with yet. "Ma'am," Boone said. He was still on his horse, because he hadn't decided when to get down, which was already less smooth than he'd planned. "You're Boone Callister," she said. Not a question. The basin wasn't that big, and she'd been in cutters flat enough times to know the ranchers. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the 3 children behind him on their horses and ponies. The twins had their hats in their laps and were very straight and deliberate, which was the twins' version of ceremony. Eli had his father's jaw-set look, which on a 9-year-old was both serious and slightly comic. "These are my kids," Boone said. "Eli and the twins, Nora and me." "I can see they are," Miriam said. She set her stitching down across the stool arm. "You have something to say to me, Mr. Callister, or did you ride 2 hours to let me figure it out?" Boone told me later that he'd had a speech. He'd composed it over the 11 days, not long but adequate. Something about the generosity of the gift and the meaning of it to his children and his intentions to repay it in kind. He had the words lined up. What he actually said was, "My kids want to thank you for the food. We were short on provisions and he stopped, started again. It mattered, the cornmeal and the venison, it mattered to them." It was not the speech he'd planned. It was, if anything, the speech under the speech, the one with the pretense stripped away. Miriam Holt looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the 3 children and her face did something. I wasn't there, but Boone described it well enough that I could picture it. Not a smile exactly, a settling, like a woman who has been waiting for someone to stop performing and just say the true thing. "You're welcome," she said. She said it simply, without the social decoration most people put around it, like she meant it and didn't need the decoration to prove she meant it. The twins, who had been holding themselves in rigid ceremony for the entire exchange, chose this moment to collectively exhale and look around at the creek and the mule and the soddy with unguarded curiosity. "Is that your mule?" Nora asked. "It is." "What's his name?" "Perkins." "That's a good name for a mule," me said, in the tone of a girl who had strong opinions about mule names and had not been asked for them until now. Miriam Holt looked at the twins for a moment with that same settling look, and then something broke through it, something genuine and warm, not quite a laugh but in that neighborhood. "Would you like to meet him?" she said. They very much would. Boone got down off his horse. He stayed 2 hours. He told me about it in pieces, over several months, the way a man tells a story he's still figuring out as he tells it. He drank her coffee, which was better than his. She showed the girls Perkins and let them feed him dry grass. Eli, who was a practical and observational child, spent 20 minutes examining the roof patch on the soddy with the seriousness of a man considering a purchase, and then told Miriam, unprompted, that the seam along the northwest corner was going to let water in when the snow came. Miriam looked at the seam and said she knew. Eli asked if she had tar paper. She said she had some but not quite enough. Eli nodded and appeared to file this away. Boone looked at the soddy, and at the root cellar that wasn't quite deep enough, and at the well, which he could see by the dry ring around it hadn't produced in at least a season. He looked at all of it and said nothing, because she hadn't asked him to look, and he wasn't in the business of telling a woman the inventory of her own problems. But he filed it away too. That ran in the family. He asked, because it would have been strange not to, how she was fixed for winter provisions. She told him she was adequate. He accepted this because she'd told him it without apology and without the kind of pause that means the opposite. He asked if she had any trouble with the range men who sometimes cut through the basin, the ones who didn't have much respect for loan claims and the people on them. She said she'd had none yet. He accepted this too, but with slightly less confidence, because the basin in deep winter got hard, and the men who caused trouble in it were the ones who knew exactly how far away everything else was. When he left, the twins reluctant, Eli still thinking about the tar paper seam, Miriam Holt stood at her camp stool and watched them go. She raised her hand when they reached the trail, the same clean, small gesture she'd made from horseback at the cross trail 12 days before. Boone raised his back. He rode home and didn't say anything for the rest of the day. But that evening, after the kids were in bed, he came and found me in the barn where I was mending a piece of harness, and he stood in the door for a minute without saying anything. Then he said, "She's not going to make it through winter in that soddy." "No," I said, because I hadn't seen it, but I'd been in the basin long enough to know what partial walls and a dry well meant when the snow came serious. "She's not going to ask anyone for help." "Probably not." He was quiet again. Then he went back to the house. But the next morning, without mentioning it or making any particular announcement, he sent Ruddy Tate into Cutter's flat for a roll of tar paper and a bundle of spruce lath. The second time he rode to Holt's Crossing, he brought the tar paper and the lath, and also Eli, who had been impossible to leave behind because he'd been the one who identified the problem in the first place and considered himself personally invested in the solution. Miriam Holt came out of the soddy when she heard them and stood with her arms crossed, not hostile but careful. "I don't remember asking," she said. "No, ma'am," Boone said. "Eli here spotted the seam. He won't sleep right if it doesn't get fixed." Eli looked up at this characterization of his motivations with the expression of a 9-year-old who understands he's being used as cover, but is willing to accept the role. Miriam looked at the roll of tar paper. She looked at Boone. She looked at Eli. She had the particular look of a woman who knows exactly what's happening and is deciding whether to be annoyed by it or not. "I'd have gotten to it," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Boone said. "We'll stay out of your way." It wasn't entirely possible to stay out of her way on a piece of property that small, but they made a reasonable effort. Boone worked the roof seam. Eli handed things up and offered his opinions, which Miriam, to her credit, received without condescension. After about an hour she brought coffee out without being asked, and after another hour she started telling Boone about a section of the south wall that she'd been less certain about than she'd let on, and he came down and looked at it with her, and they stood in the cold and talked about plaster and wattle, and what you could do with spruce gum and river clay when you had the time to let it cure. She knew what she was talking about. That surprised him, and he wasn't careful enough about not letting it show. She caught it. "You thought I was just getting by until something rescued me," she said, not angry, direct. "I don't think that now," he said. "But you thought it when you came." He considered lying about this, which would have been the comfortable thing, but Boone wasn't built for comfortable lies. "Maybe," he said, "partly." She nodded like this was fair. "Most men think that when they see a woman alone on a hard claim," she said. "Some of them stop thinking it when they look closer." She went back inside after that, and he finished the south wall brace, and by the time they rode out in the late afternoon, the soddy was meaningfully tighter than it had been in the morning. Miriam stood at the door and watched them go. "Same as before," Eli reported as they rode. She raised her hand. "I know," Boone said. "I saw it." Eli was quiet for a mile. "Then she's not what I thought either." "What did you think?" "I thought she'd be more like an old lady," Eli said, with the candor of 9 years old. "She's not old, she's just settled." Boone didn't answer, but I know, because he told me later, on that evening porch with the mountains going purple, that the word settled landed in him somewhere and stayed. November came down hard that year. The first real snow hit on the 7th, 6 inches overnight, and the temperature dropped to where the creek at the home ranch skinned over by mid-morning. Boone's range was well set for it, a solid house, a deep-dug root cellar, 2 milk cows in a tight barn, hay laid in from August. The Callister ranch was not rich, but it was prepared. He thought about Holt's Crossing for 3 days before he did anything about it. On the 4th day after the first snow, he sent Ruddy with a pack horse carrying 100 pounds of provisions, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, a small wheel of hard cheese, and 2 smoked haunches from the autumn butchering. He didn't go himself. He sent Ruddy with the provisions and a note that said only, "From the Callister Range. Return not expected." Ruddy came back and reported that Miriam Holt had accepted the provisions with a look on her face that Ruddy described as, like she was deciding whether to send them back or not, and decided not. "Did she say anything?" Boone asked. "She said to tell you the south wall held fine in the storm." Boone nodded. He went back to his work. A week later, a package arrived at the Callister Ranch by way of a rider passing through, not Miriam herself. Inside were 3 pairs of knitted wool stockings, children's-sized, 1 pair per child, each pair a different color so they wouldn't get mixed up. No note. The twins put theirs on immediately and refused to take them off for 2 days. Eli examined his with the gravity of someone receiving a tool he intended to use seriously, and then wore them, and they were the warmest stockings on the ranch. Boone held the paper the stockings had been wrapped in for a moment before he set it in the kindling box, and I noticed this because I noticed most things about Boone in that season. The second big snow came on November 22nd, and it came serious, nearly 2 feet in 36 hours, with wind out of the northwest that built drifts against anything that stood still. The home ranch was uncomfortable but fine. We had wood, we had food, we had 4 walls and a sound roof. At 4 in the morning on the second night of the storm, I heard Boone get up. I heard him get dressed. I heard the barn door and then hoofbeats going northeast. I didn't follow him. I knew where he was going. What he found at Holt's Crossing, and what he told me about, later piece by piece, was this. The northwest corner of the soddy roof had held through the first storm but given way sometime in the second, not collapsed entirely, but sprung a seam that was letting snow in at a rate that had already soaked the bedroll and the better part of the floor. The root cellar door had blown open and filled with 2 feet of drift. The mule Perkins was fine in his solid shelter, but the shelter's door had frozen shut, and Miriam hadn't been able to get it open in the dark to check on him, which was bothering her considerably more than the snow on her floor. She answered his knock with a lantern and the expression of a woman who had been awake since midnight dealing with things, and who was not going to pretend she didn't need help, but was also not going to dramatize the situation. "The coroner went," she said. "I know," Boone said. I saw it from outside. The mule. I'll get the door. He got the door. Perkins was cold but fine. Boone broke ice from the root cellar, dug the drift clear, got the door reseated. Then he went back inside the soddy and looked at the roof seen by lantern light and made a decision that was, he told me, not actually hard in the moment, though it should have been more complicated than it was. You need to come to the ranch, he said. I'm not leaving the claim. I'm not saying leave the claim. I'm saying come through the storm, come back when it breaks. She looked at the snow coming in through the roof seam. Just through the storm, he said again, like it was a practical matter, like it was the most ordinary thing. Mr. Callister, she said. Boone. She was quiet. The snow tapped at the tin patches. Boone, she said, like she was trying the word for fit, I haven't asked you for a single thing. No, he said, you haven't. You left food for my children in the night and didn't put your name on it. I don't know many people who do things that way. She was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. It's practical, he said. The roof's not safe tonight. Miriam Holt looked at the lantern. She looked at the snow coming in. She had the look of a woman who had lived alone long enough to know the difference between pride that serves you and pride that gets you killed. Perkins comes, she said. Of course Perkins comes, Boone said. They rode back through the storm in the early morning dark. Boone in front, Miriam behind, Perkins on a lead behind her. The snow was still coming hard and the wind had teeth. Boone knew the trail to the home ranch the way he knew his own hands, but he told me later it was slow going, an hour and a half for a ride that took 40 minutes in fair weather. She came in through the kitchen door. I was up. I'd heard Boone leave and had been awake waiting, and I put coffee on without making a thing of it. Miriam Holt stood in the kitchen of a man she had met twice and looked around at it with the careful attention of someone noting exits, and then she sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup I set in front of her. You're a Cade, I said. I know who you are, she said. You were at the Crossroads camp. Yes, ma'am, I made the mush with your cornmeal. She looked at me steadily. Something in her expression did the thing I was starting to recognize, that settling, like a woman deciding whether to let something matter. Good mush, she said. Best those kids had eaten in 3 days, I said honestly. Better than anything I could have made without it. She nodded and drank her coffee. The twins found her at breakfast, came downstairs drawn by the smell of the kitchen, and found a woman at their father's table, which hadn't happened since their mother. They both stopped in the doorway. Miriam looked at them. Good morning, Nora. Good morning, me. She'd remembered which was which. That more than anything did something to them that I watched happen and have never been quite able to describe. They sat down at the table with an ease that I hadn't seen in them since Clara, and that was all there was to it. Eli came down, assessed the situation, looked at the window where the storm was still throwing itself against the glass, and then looked at Miriam. The roof went, he said. The northwest corner, she said. You were right about the seam. He received this with the satisfaction of a person who has learned something, which was his version of the twins' ease. I should have put more lath in the far corner, he said. You did what you could with what was there, Miriam said. It's not a failure, it's information. Eli thought about this. He nodded and sat down. I made breakfast. Boone came in from the barn and sat at the head of the table, and for the first time since the spring, he was sitting at a table with 4 other people, and the room had a fullness to it that I felt even from the stove. The storm broke on the 3rd day. Miriam stayed for 4. She was not a guest in the way that made everyone careful. She worked. She found what needed doing and did it. The 3rd morning I came in to find her at the kitchen table with 3 pairs of trousers spread out, making repairs that the children's winter roughhousing had demanded, but that hadn't gotten done because none of us were handy with a needle. She'd found the mending box on her own, and she was working through it with the economical speed of someone who did this for a living. "You don't have to," I started. "I'm not doing it for obligation," she said, not looking up. "I'm doing it because the trousers need it and I have needle and thread and nobody else here does." I went back to breakfast. She and Boone talked in the evenings, after the children were in bed, not much, but the kind of talking that covers real ground because both people are being direct. She told him about Parrish Ford and the husband who had died 3 years ago, and the reason she decided a claim in the basin was better than the option she had behind her. She didn't make it sad exactly, but she didn't make it less than it was either. He told her about Clara, which he hadn't told anyone since the funeral, and he did it in the same way, plainly, without performing either the grief or the recovery. I know all this because the children's room shared a thin wall with the front room, and Eli told me, in the careful way of a 9-year-old who understands he's holding important information and is deciding who gets to have it. "They talk like they already know each other," Eli said. "Maybe they do," I said. "That's not how it usually works." "How does it usually work?" Eli thought about this. "People talk around each other first," he said, "for a long time, then they talk to each other. Your pa doesn't do things that way." "No," Eli said, with a certainty that settled it. On the 4th morning the sun came up sharp, and the temperature rose enough to say the storm was genuinely over. Miriam came in from checking Perkins and stood in the kitchen door and announced that she'd ride back to Holt's Crossing after breakfast. Boone was at the table. He didn't look up from his coffee. "I'll send Ruddy to help you with the roof seam," he said. "Ruddy doesn't have to." "He wants the work," Boone said, which was more or less true. Ruddy liked building things. She looked at him. "Boone." He looked up then. "I can take care of my claim," she said. "I've been doing it." "I know that," he said. "I'm not arguing with it." "Then what are you doing?" He was quiet for a moment. Boone Callister, who was not a man of excess words, looked at this woman who had left food in the night for his children and accepted a winter refuge without losing a single inch of her own standing, and he told her the true thing again. "I'm trying to find reasons to be useful to you," he said, "because I don't know yet what else to offer." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's a strange thing to say," Miriam said. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with that careful, settling look. Then she sat back down at the table and picked up her coffee cup. "The roof seam first," she said, "the well after. I've been thinking about a new bore placement east of the existing site. The ground reads different there." Boone nodded. He refilled his cup. "I know a driller out of Cutter's Flat," he said. "He's reasonable." "Then we'll talk to him," Miriam said. And that, as near as I can figure, was where it started, not with a declaration, but with a well placement and a reasonable driller, and 2 people sitting at a table talking about what came next as though it was already agreed that they'd be talking about it. I want to be careful here, because the rest of it isn't a story that moves fast. It's a story that moves the way the basin moves, at its own pace, solid underfoot, no wasted motion. Boone Callister did not sweep Miriam Holt off her feet. He wasn't built for sweeping, and she wasn't built for being swept. What happened was slower and more honest than that, and I think in the end more real. Through November and December he rode to Holt's Crossing every week and a half, sometimes twice. He brought things, not provisions anymore, because she'd made it clear that her larder was her own business. He brought his skills and his hands. The driller came out in early December and they found water 22 feet east of the old bore, clean and reliable, and Boone and Ruddy dug and cased the new well over 3 days. The south wall got its permanent clay plaster. A proper root cellar door got hung, with a latch that wouldn't ice over. Miriam came to the ranch too. The first time was Christmas. Boone had asked her plainly, and she had said yes plainly, the way they both did things. She brought the twins a piece of blue ribbon each and Eli a pocket knife with a bone handle, which was the right gift for Eli, and told Boone something about how much she'd been paying attention. After Christmas, she came roughly as often as he went to the crossing. The children learned to count on this the way children learn to count on the things they want to be true but haven't dared say out loud. The twins started leaving small things on the table where she usually sat: a rock, a feather, a dried flower, which was their version of marking her place. Eli started timing certain questions until she was there, the ones that required someone direct and knowledgeable, because he'd learned that Miriam gave him the same quality of answer she gave everyone: straight, without condescension. Boone moved around her the way water moves around something solid in the channel, not pushing, not pulling, finding the natural line. I watched all of this and said nothing because it was not mine to say, but I noticed that he smiled more that winter than he had in the year before it. Not often, he was still Boone, but it was there, a ruined man coming back to level. It was February when he asked her. He told me about it afterward, in the way he'd been telling me things all winter, pieces, at his own pace. He'd ridden to the crossing on a Tuesday, the kind of February afternoon that teases you with almost warmth and then takes it back by 4 o'clock. Miriam was in the soddy working, which she usually was. The claim had a tighter, more purposeful look to it than it had had in October, the south wall solid, the new well cased and clean, the mule shelter expanded and properly chinked. She'd done more of it herself than she'd let him do, which was the way she did things. He sat down at her small work table, the one she used for the mending. She was finishing a coat lining for a rancher in Cutter's Flat, 4 days of careful work for what amounted to 2 days of provisions. He watched her work for a while without saying anything, which was something they'd learned to do in each other's company: be quiet without it being uncomfortable. After a while he said, "I want to ask you something." She kept her needle moving. "Ask it." "I want to ask you if you'd consider coming to the ranch, permanent." Her needle stopped. "Not as a housekeeper," he said before she could answer, because he knew that would be the wrong thing and he wanted to be clear. "Not as anything except, I don't know the word exactly, as a partner, as someone to sit at the table with, as—" He stopped and started again. "The kids need someone, and I need someone, and you're the only person I've met since Clara who makes the room feel like it has all its walls." Miriam Holt set her stitching down on the table. She was quiet for long enough that he started to think he'd read it wrong, which would have cost him in a way that surprised him by how much. "The claim," she said. "Your claim stays your claim," he said. "I'm not asking you to give it up. I'm asking you to not be alone on it." "And you," she said, "you're alone on yours." "Yes," he said. She looked at him, that long, careful, settling look. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I'm set in my ways. I have opinions about nearly everything." "I've noticed," Boone said. "I don't mind. Perkins comes." "Perkins has already got a stall," Boone said. "I cleared it last week." Something crossed her face then, something she didn't quite suppress in time. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the same family, and it was real. "You were sure of yourself," she said. "No," he said, honest as he always was when it mattered. "I was hopeful. There's a difference." She was quiet again. Then she picked up her stitching and made 4 careful stitches and set it down again. "There are things to settle," she said. "About the claim, about how the household works, about what the children need and how I fit into that." "Yes," he said. "All of that. And we'd talk about all of it." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The big, quiet, grief-weathered man who had sent provisions without his name on them and ridden through a blizzard at 4 in the morning, and cleared a stall for an ancient mule on the hope of an answer he hadn't gotten yet. "Then I'll come," Miriam Holt said. They were married in April, in the front room of the Callister Ranch, with myself and Ruddy Tate as witnesses and the Reverend from Cutter's Flat presiding. The twins wore the blue ribbon she'd brought them at Christmas, one piece each, braided into their hair. Eli stood at his father's left side with the solemnity of a boy who has thought through his responsibilities and intends to meet them. It was a plain ceremony, which suited them both. There was no performance about it. It was two people who had been direct with each other from the first real moment and were being direct now. Afterward there was dinner. Miriam had cooked it herself, which Boone had argued against and lost. And then the Reverend left and Ruddy drifted to the barn with the tact of a man who understands when he's excess, and I made myself scarce by way of the coffee and the back porch. From the porch I could see through the kitchen window. The four of them were still at the table, Boone and Miriam and the three children, and the light was on them, warm and ordinary, and they were talking. I couldn't hear what they were saying. It didn't matter. What I could see was that the room had all its walls. I've been asked over the years what I make of the whole thing, whether it was the kindness that made it happen, or the storm, or the children, or just the particular way two stubborn, straight-talking people sometimes find each other when everything else falls away. I don't know the answer to that, and I've stopped trying to work it out. What I know is what I saw. Boone Callister, who had been stoned for the better part of a year, came back to himself because of a flour sack left in the dark by a woman who didn't put her name on it. And Miriam Holt, who had been making do alone on a hard claim for longer than she needed to, let herself be found by a man who cleared a stall for her mule on the hope of an answer. There's something in that I can't quite put words to. The giving without expecting, the receiving without losing yourself, the two together making something neither had alone. The claim at Holt's Crossing stayed in Miriam's name, which mattered to her. Boone never argued the point. In time they ran some of their stock on the east pasture near the crossing, and there was a proper house up there, not a soddy, that Boone and Eli built the summer Eli was 11. They used it for range camp, and sometimes in July when the main ranch got hot, Miriam went up there for a week with her mending work and the quiet she'd always kept for herself, and Boone let her have it without question, because he understood by then the difference between a woman who needed space and a woman who was going away. She always came back inside a week, usually less. Perkins made the trip both ways and lived to a very old age. The twins grew up knowing that a small kindness in the dark can change the whole direction of a life, because their father told them the story enough times that it became part of how they understood the world. Eli already knew this, I think, before his father told him. Some children come into the world knowing it. I kept my post as foreman at Callister Range for another 16 years, until my knees gave out and Boone told me, in the plain-spoken way he told you everything important, that I'd earned my boots off years and the bunkhouse was mine as long as I wanted it. I took him up on it. On summer evenings I sit on the back porch where I can see the kitchen window, and the light comes on when supper's ready, and sometimes I can hear the four of them, 5 now, with the boy they had together, who has Boone's jaw and Miriam's way of looking at the world and making it yield, talking around the table about the day's work and the stock, and what the weather's doing, and whether Perkins has enough hay in his stall. The most ordinary things in the world, the most earned. Boone Callister rode 3 days through a hard basin on the chance that a woman's kindness deserved an answer. He got one. It turned out to be the best of his life. That's all there is to it, and it's enough.